Well, welcome to our annual lecture. This is the fourth in the series, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Chris Wise to give it. I'd like to thank CIBSE patrons for supporting this lecture. Now, CIBSE patrons are all those organisations which support us in our drive to improve the future. And because CIBSE is a membership organisation of individuals, we need them a lot, and they do a great deal of work for us. And they help us to strengthen the industry and collaborating and working with us all the time. So I've known Chris Wise for a while, and he is actually one of my heroes, so I'm really pleased to see this. He's a charismatic engineer who inspires others to follow their imagination and use their skill to make things. And I first sat on a stage with him and introduced him, I think it was at the Royal Institution with Sunan Prasad from the RIBA, where they did a great performance. I'm sure he'll do the same tonight. The lecture will be in three parts, and it's going to be entitled, I Wonder What It Would Feel Like If We Did That. It covers the role of the vital trace elements of imagination, empathy and physicality in engineering design, and a look at whether these human traits help us create contemporary engineering or lead us into folly. Which is interesting. Surely it can't be that, no. Chris is one of a new generation of engineering designers, and as a structural engineer he's very welcome here, especially because once upon a time he did tell me that the future was actually environmental engineering. So we'll see where we're going. In the early part of his career, he worked for Arup and joined the board of Arup's building engineering, looking after about 500 multidisciplinary engineers worldwide. And then in 1999, he co-founded Expedition Engineering, where he's now the senior partner and major shareholder. Chris was also Imperial College's first professor of creative design between 1998 and 2005. And Yale's Architectural Davenport Professor in 2006. At age 41, Chris became one of the RSA's small band of Royal Designers for Industry, and in 2007 was elected as President, or Master. As Master, he's broadening the Royal Designers community away from their craft-based roots to include those grappling with the big design questions of our day, such as energy, social policy, crime, health, education, genetics, and climate change. As you can see, he has big thoughts and understands that engineers have got a lot to do, and we can only do it together. So Chris, I invite you to take the podium and give us your lecture.
Can you hear me at the back? You can? That's marvellous. So I apologise for this jacket, which I wore in honour of the occasion. I don't normally wear a jacket. And I was down at the National Theatre this afternoon, and somebody selling the big issue came up and said to the girl I was with, well, she's one of our directors actually, "Is that your husband?" And she said, "No." And she said, "Oh, I thought you look like a solicitor and he looks like a magistrate. So I'm going to take it off, if you don't mind." So if the man from the big issue says that, you know you're in trouble. Thank you very much, Andy, and thank you for inviting me to speak. I'll do my best not to talk about anything that you know about, for fear of putting my foot in it. If I do head into that sort of territory, please divert me. These are my sons, or a few years ago now, and of course they're doing what all kids do, which is just exploring the world around them and splashing in puddles backwards and forwards. the thing about being a child is that, of course, you have no idea what's going to happen. You just take the world as it is, and you try and interact with it in whatever way you might be able to. And as we get older, we condition our behaviour quite a lot. And engineers, I mean, I know there are a number of academics in the audience. Engineers are heavily conditioned. And so I want to talk about engineers as human beings, really. And I've got a lot of slides here which I'm just going to use as prompts for myself, just to help me think of the people who are involved in all of this, because we have codes of practice and we have regulations and we have government departments and think tanks and the chief construction officer and whatever Paul Morrell is these days. If he's here. No, he's not here. They're all made up of people. They all attempt to do their best, I'm sure, but as often as not, we're hamstrung by each other as much as liberated. So I want to talk about imagination, the engineer's imagination in particular, but also the imagination of those for whom we're designing. I want to talk a bit about empathy and trying to put yourself in somebody else's place when you're working, which is very hard because a lot of us we work all over the world. I'm sure that many of you work all over the world, and to try and imagine what it's like to be growing up in China or Brazil or anywhere is very difficult. And in fact, Norman Foster famously, when we were doing the competition for the Grand Bleu in Marseille, he went down and drove around the town and said to the people in the south of France, so of course you like sitting outdoors, you people from Marseille. And they say, yeah, we do, but only when the Mistral's not blowing. At which point he lost the job, and Will Alsop won the job because he said, I'm going to buy a boat and I'm going to park it in the harbour and I'll design your project from there, which was what they want, culturally what they wanted to hear. And it's very easy, and as many times as you get it right, you're quite likely to get it wrong. You think what it's like trying to even imagine designing a building in your own hometown, and how sensitive an issue that would be, because you know so much about it. It's very hard. The further away from home you get, the harder it is. And I also want to talk about physicality, because the engineering is it's a continual fight. It's a continual balancing act against the natural world and the human beings who occupy the natural world. And it's very common in engineering for people to, and especially with the advent of computers, which can do lots of great things, but it's very common for people just simply to forget that they're dealing with physical things. Things that are very strong, very powerful, very heavy, and will bite you in the bottom. So this is our little standard project plan or project map. Looks a bit like this, and I'm going to talk about the bit in the middle: conceive, test, and judge. So the imagination, the interaction, subjective and objective way that you find out whether your stuff's got a fighting chance of being any good. And then in particular, judgment, which is when you say, right, I've done enough tests and enough analysis and enough thinking that I finally think that what we've collectively designed in this very complicated situation is good enough to go ahead and make it, because you can only make one project, you can't make lots. And that little bit in the blue bubble is really design. And I'm fundamentally a person who does design for a living. And I make things and I use things and I learn and I need things in my spare time a lot. But actually, when I'm at work, I'm fundamentally a designer, and I'm in that blue bubble. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So the wonder. It's people actually take a bit of time and trouble to if they take a bit of time and trouble to make space for themselves. It's quite a civilizing thing. The Spanish say the English are very uncivilized because we rush around so much we don't make any time for ourselves. But when you get the chance just to have half an hour or an hour on your own in a quiet place, it's amazing what you can flush out that you can't do when you're buzzing around with lots of other people. So the notion of trying to just spend a bit of time getting away from each other in the nicest possible way is actually rather important. And we've done a lot of design teaching over the years, and the conclusion we've reached is that there are lots of specialist bubbles of different shades and different colors. So CIBSE, every sort of engineer, architects, designers, clients, all that sort of thing. But the bit that's much more important, and we seem to forget about most of the time in our professional lives, is that we have an awful lot in common with each other. So because we're not trained in it, you do 2,000 hours of, roughly 2,000 hours of taught engineering when you're becoming a professional engineer. That's equivalent to one working year. You've got 39 or 49 or 59 other years to build up your knowledge. So all that blue stuff is really rather important, and that's the bit that I think is misunderstood and misread. And people tend to put themselves in, they're happy to sit in those little coloured bubbles and not to play across the broader spectrum. So, and one of the things that engineers are not famous for is having emotions. I mean, engineering is meant to be an unemotional pastime. And this is, I'm sure you all know, because you would have studied him at university, a man called Plutchik, who came up with this thing called the wheel of emotion. And it starts, well, in fact, it goes in a big circle. And as you work your way around the circle, it shades from one emotion to the next. So joy gives way to trust, which then you think, oh, I'm trusting him a bit too much. So then a bit of fear, and then the fear turns into surprise, and then actually when it doesn't quite turn out as you expect, it becomes sadness, and then that turns into disgust, and you go right around the circle and you come back to joy again eventually. So the notion that engineers might engage with some of this, I think, is worth just exploring a bit, because if we're human beings designing for other human beings, and human beings feel all of these emotions, then maybe we should think about it, because it's not just numbers. So this is an example of something fairly disgusting, actually. So this is somebody putting up the Empire State Building in 1930-something, 1930. And there it is, going up. And they did, according to the engineering news record, 57,000 tons of steel in record time. In 6 months, I think, 7 months. That is a photograph outside our office yesterday, using the same sorts of beams. So when I say it's a matter of disgust, I'm ashamed of it, really, as an engineer. So there's a typical beam, and works hard in the middle, easy at the ends, but it's the same all the way along. And a beam like that for a building, not quite as big as this, but for an office building, weighs about 3/4 of a ton. And if you tune the beam, so it's just a tiny bit more responsive, which of course we can't make. There isn't an industry that can make these. They only make the red ones. So it works just as hard all the way along. It weighs 500 kilos instead of 700. So it doesn't change its performance. It performs exactly the same, but it has 30% less steel in it. Across the planet, because so many of these beams are used, that's 30 million tons of steel saved every year without changing the performance at all, which is just ridiculous. Enough energy saved in the embodied energy side to boil 700 cups of tea for everyone on the planet, which is a lot of tea. I thought I'd play this just because that was a fairly rose-tinted view of how the world might be. Okay, we're not going to have that, because I think the thing about it is, of course, you can't have it. And why can't you have it? Because people spend a lot of time researching and making other things. So here's one. The forces required to drag sheep over various surfaces. There's somebody dragging sheep over the various surfaces. Here's another useful one. A bra that can be usefully converted into 2 gas masks. One for the wearer and one to be given to a needy bystander. Yeah. And here is a even more scary email. This is an email which we received, you can see, 19th of September 2011, from a very, very large global manufacturing company. And the key line, we were saying to them, why can't you make these blue perfect beams? Give us a machine that will make those, because we want those. And they said, well, we can do that. And so they went off back into their industry, and sure enough, all the people there said, well, we don't want to sell less steel and make less steel. We want to sell more steel. And so we're not going to, even though we could make such a machine, and in fact we even got a plan for one, we're not going to because it will mess around our shareholders. So we're not going to do it. And to see that coming from the horse's mouth, so to speak, is scary. The resisting lightweighting. Stainless steel people, interestingly, because stainless steel can't sell as much as it makes, at least in the construction sector, they're keen on it. So we may find that by using an apparently unfamiliar material, at least for building engineers, we may find that we can show the way for people a bit later. But it's scary that the shareholders of the steel companies are basically the people who have got their foot on the brake, so we can't save the 30 million tons. And you say, why is that? Well, I think the clue is here. This is the plot of the DNA of various species compared to the human being that's at the bottom. So you don't have to read it, but the human being is 100%. Of course, we share all of our DNA. Chimpanzee, 96%, a mouse, 92%. The one I liked, and I think is the explanation as to why we don't use the red beams. We do use the red beams, not the blue ones, is that we share 50% of our DNA with a banana. And which is, every time I see this guy now, I'm going to say, which half of you is the banana? So in the imagination, the question is, I mean, what we try to do is just, what people do and have done for millennia. It's why we've come out of caves and we've got a building like this and computers and things, because some people think about what's possible as opposed to what is convenient and expedient. So, but the world, as I said, is a big and heavy place. So a few years ago, we did a series of pieces of reconstruction work for the BBC, and I got one or two clips of what happened during that construction work, because it illustrates some of these themes. The first one of which is that the natural world is big and heavy. And if you spend your whole time working on a computer, it's very hard to remember how big and heavy it is, but it comes home to you when you actually try.
Manpower it is then. The team can't even use pulleys, since the Egyptians didn't have them 2,500 years ago.
All right, Carolyn,
Haul away. Haul away.
Right,
Go on then.
you're getting it. Good show.
Listen, I can't do it.
Shall we just try with the empty basket first?
Oh.
Well, I mean, it's a bit unfair.
I think they would have had several people at the top.
Yeah.
But,
Well, I'll go up there, and we'll see if we can lift a bit more sensible.
Is it full now? Full?
Is it full up?
All right.
Okay. Ready?
That's a bit easy.
3, 1, 2, 3, go. I think it's 100,000 of these baskets. Take a minute each, that's 100,000 minutes. Call it 2 minutes each, because they had to take it 25 metres up rather than the 8 metres we've just done. No, 60 minutes in an hour, 2,000. 300 days?
That's just to empty out a hole 25 meters deep to put a sarcophagus in, 300 days. And it's really hard work. And so, if you have that at the front of your mind rather than the back of your mind, you suddenly have a much greater respect for the natural environment. The human environment is changing very fast, as we all know. And so we did a project that was a regeneration project that was started by Maggie Thatcher up in Stockton. And Stockton's the poorest town in the UK, or second poorest in the UK, and she went up there and was confronted by a bloke who had made, I think he said 2,000 or 3,000 job applications in 6 months and been rejected every single time. He used to be an iron worker, and he managed to get through the security cordon, and he said, you're the Prime Minister, do something about it, Mrs. Thatcher. And she said, And but in the end, she came back to London, and she set up the Tees Valley Regeneration Corporation, which did regenerate a lot of the Tees Valley, and it's still struggling, but it's a hell of a lot better than it was. And there are generation after generation after generation of human beings who worked in the ironworks, places like this. And the project we had was to do a little bridge across the top right-hand corner, across the T's, and it was meant to be a symbol of regeneration. So we went up and we talked to these guys. They remember what it used to be like. The last job they had 20 odd years ago was actually to demolish the building that was employing them. It's a terrible human tragedy. This guy's been living there for 30 years. Second dirtiest, grimiest place I've ever seen in my life. It's Stockton. So this is it after Maggie had spent money. The University of Durham has an annex, and there's all sorts of nice little buildings on the south side. North side eventually will be more of the same and some houses. So you go up there and there's a competition, and you doodle away on the train, or in the car, wherever. When I say you need a bit of headspace, this is what happens in the headspace. I sketch a lot, and I think it's a bit of a lost art. I know there are a number of people here who have probably been involved with drawing at work with Trevor Flynn and his crew, and drawing at work are very good at trying to reinvent the use of sketching as a tool for designers in the built environment. And eventually you end up with something like the one on the right-hand side, which is you think that's a plausible, half-decent idea. And then in a time-honored fashion, you buy some toilet chain, hang it, photograph it, turn it up the other way, and that gives you the shape of your bridge. Then you've got to work out how to make it.
Not only were the blocks needed for the floor and the walls of the chamber, hundreds were also carefully shaped to build the vaulted roof.
If you imagine these are limestone blocks, the Egyptians had a system which was quite clever, and it was so clever that it's still used today. And the way they did it was using something called centering, which is a mobile support for the arch, probably made out of timber, like this.
The timber centering would have been raised up on wedges. The centering then acted as a temporary support for the tapered blocks.
You can have the honour of putting in the last piece, which is called the
Keystone.
That's right.
As in cops, presumably.
So, okay. Now, obviously, if we just pull this out now, the whole lot would knock out. But if we just take the wedges, just when I say after 3, 2, 1, go. Ta-da! And it just stays there.
So it's about the subtlety, just the wedges, which are just a neat, simple trick. And I'm trying, most of them invented by trial and error, but it's when you get a good idea, it's worth hanging on to it. And so we had a go, along with lots of others, at designing the velodrome for the Olympics. And being in London, we weren't going to go for it, which is a sad thing, because we thought we're not going to get the job. We only have a small practice, or relatively small by comparison with some of the huge organizations that are out there now. But we thought, in the end, well, there's only going to be one really sort of main venue for the Olympics, and we will go for it. And so we'd actually worked with a guy called Mike Taylor at Hopkins about a year earlier, doing a project for Antarctica, which was a walking building project. So we actually designed 2 research stations for 60 people each that were designed to get up and walk across the ice when the ice was flowing towards the open sea. So as it was going about a mile a year, and the idea was after a few years you get up and you walk a few miles inland, at which point you don't end up in the water. And we had such a good time with Mike on that, we thought, well, we need something really inventive and sort of well gelled, a really good collaborative effort amongst the team. So we went to Mike and said, let's have a go at it, even though a velodrome obviously got nothing to do with a walking building in Antarctica. But the purpose of the velo is contrary to popular opinion, and I hope there's nobody from the ODA listening to this webcast, but contrary to popular opinion, of course it's for the Olympics at the beginning, but its principal job is to be a home for cycling in the south of England for the life of the building. So 60 years is the life of the building, so at least that long. And mountain biking, BMX, track and road riding. So it's a community facility. That's what we were trying to design, with a number one fantastic opportunity of a really good housewarming party at the beginning in the form of the Olympics. And And of course, what we wondered was, firstly, there'd be lots of other people going for it. Could we do it on time? Could we do it on budget? Could we do it on a very small site, slightly larger than a postage stamp? Could we do it gracefully? Could we do it as light as an airship? Because we designed a human-powered airship a couple of years earlier, and so we thought that would be something to aspire to. Something very naturally tough, something very efficient, naturally efficient. So we imagine what would happen if a racing bike saddle, well, actually that's not quite a racing bike saddle, but a bike saddle, and a spider met in a nightclub and got their act together. What would they come up with? And the answer is a Pringle, a very lightweight racing saddle. And so we thought that would be the form of the building, and we'd sit it in a bowl. And I say this is about imagination. It's actually just about, none of this is particular. Pringles and bowls like this we've all got around our houses. There's nothing particularly groundbreaking about it, but at least you've got to think it's possible. And we took all those things together and just made a beautiful bowl shaped around the track and a very simple saddle on the top, stretched as if it was a spider's web, and that was our project. And Mike Taylor said it'd be fantastic, and this was a stroke of genius on his part, was to put that break in just through there, which goes right around the building, so you can see into the building and out. It's the highest point in the Olympic Park, which lightens the building anyway, but also and sort of celebrates it, but at the same time makes it very, very democratic. So you can go there with your family, you can sit there and enjoy yourselves. Even if you're not cycling, you just look at the view. So that little blue section was Mike's contribution. It was really good. So I'm going to come back to that in a second, the Velo, because there was a bit of imagination. Those are the things we had woven in. I just want to talk a bit about feeling, and in particular sensing whether or not what you've imagined has got any chance of working. And there's Johnny Wilkinson, who appears to be a very tortured soul, judging by the extracts in the Times recently, if you know who Johnny Wilkinson is. Manic rugby playing kicker, just practices. He does it over and over and over and over and over and over and over until he's fed up with kicking. And he tunes his technique and his skill in the light of his experience and refines it to be as perfect as possible. And then any small change, like the change in the rugby ball, completely ruins his skill. And of course, it's all very well being a rugby player when hopefully a rugby ball stays roughly the same, which it turns out it didn't recently in the World Cup. But if you're designing buildings and things are changing all the time. So it's no good honing your skill to be perfect at one thing, because you're almost certain next time you're going to be designing something completely different, or at least slightly different, at which point your skill is possibly useless. And the other thing is, in attempting to interact with something like that, it's really good idea occasionally just to kick the bloody hell out of it. So this is my son, Ali, on the beach. He's only just started playing rugby, and he literally, about a week before this, bought himself a rugby ball, and he was determined to find out how to kick the ball like Johnny Wilkinson. And so, and what I found was really interesting about this photograph, which is probably much more interesting than the rugby ball and buildings, is how well balanced he is, and naturally, without any sort of sense. So there's no computer involved in this. He just does it. He's got a natural grace. He's much more graceful than me, and he's put so much effort into it, and yet still in balance. And I think that's if you could design things which have that quality, things that are really pushing it, but at the same time graceful. Then you really, and occasionally people pull it off, but it's very rare. So this is an example of a building which does, it really does push it. If you know anything about Gothic architectures, they're right on the limit. And I've always, that's one of my other sons, but I've always gone around the place saying, these are prototypes for contemporary buildings. They're very good prototypes, naturally ventilated, naturally lit, natural materials. The architecture and the engineering are the same. You've got high thermal mass, thermal buffers between nighttime and daytime and all that sort of stuff. And I've been saying it for years and years and years, and then about 2 weeks ago there was a seminar that Field and Clegg Bradley ran in Bath Abbey, and we were all sitting in there all day, and it was absolutely freezing. It's really, really freezing. And we were sitting near the windows, which of course you're not allowed to double glaze the windows in an abbey, for obvious reasons, and it was just freezing, absolutely desperate. So I slightly revised my view. Anyway, they're pretty cool things. And in the old days, you had to study them by pen and ink drawings. I did a thesis on Salisbury when I was at university, and hand calculations. And that was an attempt to understand that beautiful thing through this sort of stuff. And you think, is there any connection between that and that? And there is. Some people would say there is. Measuring it, trying to interact with the physicality of it. So when they built those things, they had no theory. All they could do was trial and error. And there was a sense of, and from time to time they exceeded the very rudimentary theoretical limits that they had, and things would fall down. So as a sort of illustration of that, we did this little experiment at one of the Royal Designers' summer schools a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, which was to buy 3 ice blocks, ship them down to Dartington Hall, put them in outdoors on a terrace, and we said to anybody who was there and people actually in the office, how long is it going to take for them to melt? Which is a fairly easy question. I mean, we're talking about predicting when the Greenland ice cap is going to melt, and when Antarctica is going to start carving, all that stuff. How long will it take for those 3 to melt? And it's a surprisingly difficult calculation. And anybody hazard a guess how long they might last? September. They're about that high, about 4 feet high, a foot thick, and about 2 feet in the other direction. You call out when you get an answer a bit later. The first thing that happened, interestingly, they started melting, of course, and we thought, well, what's going to happen is they're going to end up like ice lollies. They'll be smaller at the top than the bottom. And because where they're in contact with the ground, it's a stable temperature, and it's warmer up during the daytime higher up. And actually what happened was they fell over. And the reason they fell over was because the water ran down the side and started washing away the ice at the bottom, at which point they destabilized themselves and fell down. So that was rather interesting. And they carried on melting after that, but they were in bits by then, at which point they melted a bit faster, perhaps. But it was a very unexpected consequence. We just thought they'd stand there happily for a while, but they didn't. Which just proves how little we know. Next one about putting theory to the test is to do with materials. How well do we understand the materials we use? And I ask this because if we did a catapult we did a big Roman catapult replica that weighed 23 tons made out of oak a few years ago. And it was stressed up, it was built according to the instructions of Vitruvius, and it was stressed up to about 4 times what contemporary practice would allow, and it still didn't break. So the materials had an awful lot more going for them than we currently allow ourselves. And if you think about, again, extrapolate that around the world, it's a scary thing. So the predictability of materials is quite interesting.
Roger has set himself another challenge. Thousands of limestone blocks were used to build the chamber around the sarcophagus at the bottom of the shaft. Roger thinks the Egyptians made the blocks by splitting them from big lumps like this, but he's never put his theory to the test.
In order to split the stone, I'm going to dig down as far as I can go in the stone. Then I'll take a wooden wedge, add water, and as the wood accepts the water, it swells and it'll push the stone apart, hopefully. I'm going to put one here, and a third one here. As they say in Arabic, inshallah, it'll be split in 2.
Now so he was trying to get to grips with the material using traditional technique. He's worked all his life with stone, and he was trying that technique, which was apparently used, he believed, and in a minute we'll see what happened. So, because the consequences weren't as he was expecting, and he had to work very hard. There are examples, there are places where you can do bits of testing and bits of research on real projects and in a sort of slightly more time-honored fashion, interact with the materials. It's not that common. But we're doing with Renzo Piano, this is a library and opera house in Athens, luckily funded by American money. And well, the Niarchos Foundation are funding it, but their money is safe in a bank in America. On the top of it is a PV array. And it's intended, because the problem with libraries and opera houses is they have very peaky demand. And so the purpose of PVs is, and it's bloody hot in Athens and lots of sun, is to take the everyday electricity demand and provide most of that. And so it's 100 meters by 100 meters PV array on the roof of the building, or on this canopy on the top. And the question is how to do that. It's in an earthquake country, so how to do it in a very light fashion that won't, because if you put something heavy up there, you can imagine what will happen is it will sway around when the earthquake comes down and kill everybody. So how to do it in something very light. So we're going to make it out of hollow ferro-cement. So ferro-cement being thin pieces of steel wire, very slushy or very fine aggregate concrete mix, and very thin, so 15 millimeters thick compared to 150 millimeters. So from the embodied energy point of view, it's fantastic. It's very low carbon. And these are some of the prototypes. So we've been, this is a technology that used to be well known and is now forgotten because it's very labor intensive. But what's coming in now is because materials costs and energy costs are going up and resources are going up, the labor component of it becomes a smaller proportion of the total cost of something. So things that were rejected as being really labor intensive have started to come back in again. And so we're trying this now, and eventually hopefully we'll automate the process. But this is a full-size prototype for one piece of the bottom. And there's another matching one on the top 5 meters away. So it's like as high as this building, but hollow. Made out of this 15 millimeter stiffened ferro-cement. And that technology is being tested now. If it comes off, we will take this from that building, which is a sort of establishment project, and use it on as many other things as we can, provided we can persuade the quantity surveying fraternity that the labour costs are genuinely as low as we imagine. One way that people have always reduced labour costs, as back to the bridge in Stockton, is to go for a sort of Meccano type kit. So very simple, make it in lots and lots of repetitive pieces, and then join them all together using gaffer tape. And so, and at Imperial, which David will probably know this, when we were teaching there, we set up this thing called the Constructionarium, which is now used by a lot of the universities around the country, designed to give students a real hands-on practical experience. And we used it to test the construction method for Stockton. So we got them to make it in the way that we thought we wanted to make Stockton, to make the sort of Meccano kit and test it all. Then we took that knowledge from the students, thank you very much, and started building a bit bigger, and then a bit bigger. So this is one of that little bit, which is there. Oops, that little bit there, if you can see it in the middle, is that bit in reality. There's massive pieces of steel. Those are the legs, the simple legs. So those are these little V-shaped legs which come up here. That's that little node in the middle. I mean, talking about big pieces here. All the sort of Meccano-esque fabrication, the biggest crane in the country. Literally, this is great stuff. I mean, it's fantastic to be involved in these sorts of things. And you know, the Stockton community, impoverished though where they were, well, or possibly because they were impoverished and so they had nothing else to do, all came down to watch this happening in the middle of a working day. And it's put up, and we use the computerized technology. I mean, this is effectively using arches, the same as that little simple stone arch that I showed, which was prototyped in Abyssinia and the Romans popularized. But this is an arch, but with everything that you don't need taken out. So this is not a fake photograph. This is actually as thin as it is. It's really, really, really thin. And tied together, instead of having huge abutments like they used to have in the old days, tied together with pieces of wire, well, big pieces of wire, and then very thin concrete hung from the wire. And I was just minded. Andy very kindly didn't mention the fact that I was Arup's director for the Millennium Bridge when I was there, but I was just reminded to mention that the Millennium Bridge, of course, had an unexpected consequence, as most people know, and it wobbled on its opening day. But because of that, a lot of knowledge went back into the gene pool, which we're using. So the fact that things go wrong is very helpful to us. And so on Stockton, we thought, is it going to wobble? So we did all the analytical things. So there's a little simple version of one of the wobbling modes. And it does wobble, you can see. So underneath, there are a bunch of mass dampers which are tucked into the coffers. It looks as though every single coffer has one, but actually, I think there are 7 altogether. About 5 tons each. They wobble out of frequency with the bridge, damp out the vibration through a little absorbing viscous system, and then it's all tested by Germans, especially imported, and some local lads, and built. And at which point, as you can see, it's very slender. The unfortunate thing is that the contractor didn't build it straight. And when I say this is a story about human beings, it is about human beings, because they did their best. They didn't try to build it crooked, but they didn't build it straight. And this long arch here, whoops, the front one, which is 120 meters long, so it's longer than the Gateshead arch, its critical point to stop it failing is just here, where it looks as though it's going to wobble over sideways. They managed to build that about 4 inches out of position, off to the side, so it already had a kink in it. And and we couldn't take the bridge down, obviously, so the only thing that could be done was to test it, full-scale load test. So the bridge was load tested using water bags, very simple, measured to see if it moved, which it did, and whether the movements mapped to the calculations, and then, more importantly, the bags were then taken off, and everybody wanted to make sure that it moved back to where it had started, which it did, thank goodness. So the reason for mentioning that is we're all slightly guilty of this, because there are consultants busily doing their thing. I'm sure this applies equally in the building services, environmental sustainability world. There are academics doing their thing, and there are contractors doing their thing. And somewhere in the middle, occasionally, the 3 of them all get together, and they do a really good piece of research. But it's quite rare, and it's more often done in the academics do theirs, the consultants do theirs, and the contractors do theirs, and actually don't talk to each other very much. It's not so helpful. So a good example of that is this from 150 years ago, but this piece of research is still being used. Mr. Hodgkinson was a mathematician, Fairbairn was a steel worker, Robert Stevenson, consultant. There they all are, trying to work out how to get across the Menai Bridge to carry a 1,000-ton rolling train. And so they did, in Fairbairn's workshop, in his ironworking shop, they did a series of tests, starting with 6 foot long, these are about the right size, tests of tubes and all sorts of funny things. And they started loading them up, and wherever they failed, they recorded them faithfully, and then they stiffened them. And they did something like 60 separate sets of tests in 6 weeks, small-scale tests, until they got a better understanding of what was going on. There was a small hiatus in the project when the funds dried up, which is nothing changes. But then they started doing bigger ones. So these are slightly bigger, and they got up to doing beams that were a bit deeper, still reinforcing it where it failed. So it failed on the bottom, so they reinforced that. Failed on the sides, so they reinforced that. Failed on the top, reinforced that. And eventually they got to this form, which was stiffened on the top, stiffened on the bottom, and stiffened on the sides, but made out of very thin plate everywhere else. Very efficient. And big enough to run the train through and to span 400 feet. So whatever that is in meters, 120, 130 meters. Actually about the same as the Stockton Bridge, interestingly, but with the train going through it. And that lasted for 110 years, 120 years, until it was eventually vandalized and health and safety out of existence. And that is the precursor of every single box girder bridge, that piece of research. And the reason it's so good is because it was done by an academic, a contractor, and a consultant, all working together rather than separately. And so what they designed and what they researched was actually very practical and could be used. And this is a box girder bridge. It doesn't look like it, but those are all boxes using the same basic theory that they did all those years ago. So we have to thank Stevenson and Fairbairn and Hodgkinson for their work, as well as the Millennium Bridge. So both of those projects, actually, both the Menai Bridge and the Millennium Bridge helped us. So back to Roger to see what happens with his stone block and his materials.
And as for Roger's block, well, he's been at it now for 3 days, and he's using modern steel wedges.
Stand back. We got a crack going. It's not exactly where we wanted it. I suppose if we had rotated the stone 90 degrees and gone into it perpendicular from the way we did, it probably would have split a lot easier.
3 days work and he cracked it in the wrong place. I mean, but what's really useful about that is that he just said it there. If we did it again, we would have done it a different way. So he learned, and it's the generations and the repeating of experiments that enable you to get some sort of sense of what's going on. So how to do all that, treading lightly on planet Earth, back to the Velo. Unfortunately, planet Earth is not the beautiful cloud forest that we had somewhere over a rainbow earlier. It looks more like this quite often. So this is the Olympic Park in sort of mid-transition from industrial brownfield into something which we're all going to enjoy next year, hopefully, except those of us who haven't got tickets, like me. And that's the site for the Velodrome. It's right next to the A12, very noisy, and it's on the old it's on the old West Ham tip, so it's on a rubbish tip. And so to pile through it to provide some sort of connection with solid ground somewhere. Now the point about, remember the coracle and the spider's web and all those sorts of things, is that the thing about the Velodrome, and the reason it is people have been so kind about it, and the reason it's so light, is because the whole thing acts together. So the curvature of the bowl comes from the curvature of the track, but it's a fantastic natural form and you can spread all the forces round, which means that it can be very light, so very low embodied energy, very low materials use, actually rather beautiful. The roof, because it's always in tension, uses the minimum amount of material. The unfortunate thing is, because we're on the West Ham tip, that whole thing has to act as a complete integrated piece. So the analysis is an absolutely fiendish thing to chase all the forces all the way around when anybody moves anywhere in the thing, and to make sure it doesn't sink into the middle of the ground. And in trying to do that, what you're trying to do is you're trying to work out how to take all those forces through, and at the same time convince a quantity surveyor and a contractor that it is physically buildable, and that the materials that you've chosen to use are not going to break in the wrong place, all that sort of stuff. So that is why a good design is important for designers, because the geometry is the geometry of a donut. The geometry of the bowl, that's the roof. The geometry of the bowl is taken from a cone, and that's it. So donuts and ice cream cones, very useful for aspiring velodrome design. It's actually very good for most stadia, in fact. So if you understand the geometry, it's a bit of research well worth doing. So toroidal geometry and conical geometry, which means that you can repeat the parts and all that sort of thing. So the roof becomes the spider's web stretched across this beautiful timberish and steel thing. The contractor, so often thought of as somebody you don't want to talk to, or if possible, I'm even holding my hand up in front of my laptop to prevent me seeing Dean, who's the guy in the middle. A man called Dean Goodlife, which is a good name for a contractor. And he was fantastic, because what his team said was, we will do the cable net. All the other teams who bid for the Velodrome said they wanted to change it to conventional steel, which would be much heavier and much less elegant and deeper and all that sort of thing. He said, we'll go for it because it's faster to build, and we'll order 14 kilometers of cables, and we'll lay them across the seating bowl, we'll stretch them into position, and there it is, finished. No scaffolding, no temporary works, no nothing. You just stretch it. 130 meters by 130 meters. That's the same size as the aquatics next door designed by Zaha. The roof's supported on these intersection pieces, which are stamped out, in a hot forge. Sorry. And then the roof covering, which is timber cassettes, just dropped on. So carbon zinc material. It's a questionable, I'm not going to mention the S word with you after it. But, it's slightly questionable in terms of whether timber is a really good material in the S sense, depending where it comes from in particular, and what happens to it afterwards. But that's it, no finish. So this building has steel spider's web, timber cassettes, no finishes, no false ceiling, no plaster, no nothing. So it's also got a lot of stuff taken out compared to a conventional building. That's the bowl. There's the finished building. You can see Mike's little slot running through here, which you can see allows the light in and out. The track is a beautiful thing, also made of timber, handmade. If you ever want a kitchen cabinet made, these are the people to go to. It's made of 40 millimeter. They lay all these trusses all the way around to a perfect geometry, all handmade, and then they lay the track by hand in random lengths of 40 by 40 large, and then paint it by hand using masking tape. I found that. Now, I'm in dangerous territory here because of the environmental side of it, but the point being, environmental designers are ahead of structural designers, as Andy mentioned earlier. I think that they're much more important and actually much more useful to the planet than structural engineers are in the future anyway. And the reason being, you can design for something to perform properly, whereas structural engineers at the moment and historically have always designed for something to perform more than properly. And there's a big difference between hitting a target and being able to exceed it by as much as you like. And most structures around here, as I mentioned on the catapult, they're 4 times over-designed. This is probably 3 times over-designed in terms of what it could actually carry, whereas the temperature can't fluctuate more than a little tiny bit from a given band, and the humidity. So the Velo is tricky because it has to be hot and humid for the competition, very brightly lit for TV, no air, no natural ventilation, all that sort of thing, but only for a few days a year. And then the rest of the time you want the opposite, not too much light, plenty of air movement, and not too warm. So it is naturally lit. It had to be insulated because this was classified as a building under building regs, and we didn't have time it was quite a fast program to convince the building control people inside the Olympics that we could treat this not as a building and be more inventive with the way that we dealt with the climatic conditions. And so it's a traditional sealed building, and you attempt to condition the spaces using natural ventilation, of course, only where people are sitting, and a bit of heating, which is applied fundamentally for the track and also when it's cold outside, and so if the air's too cold coming in. The roof lights give you 300 lux at track level, which is what you need for 340 days of the year, and then there's artificial lights, unfortunately, for the telly. That's what it looks like inside. And it's fine. It's a very even light, good for cycling. Even with natural ventilation and reasonable amount of fresh air, you can get the temperature at the track to be the right temperature. So it's about 28 to 30 on a really, really hot day at the track. And the skin is a timber, it's a Western red cedar skin on the outside. Can only be put in because the angle of the building is like that, so it protects most of the worst of the rain and particularly runoff, and also UV as well, it cuts down. That is clipped onto the outside of the structure. They cycle round, and of course what happens is you get, so Chris Hoy has a trip round, closely followed by Boris, who in his inimitable fashion described it, this is how he described the velodrome, is lovingly rubbed with rhubarb. And he's right, because it creates jobs in a new craft, that of English rhubarb rubbing. It will go on and on. You can imagine. It represents a fantastic investment for sport and society, the development of a new craft of rhubarb rubbing. Rhubarb is used as to give the red colour for the Western red cedar, to keep it red. And the whole of Norfolk is now growing rhubarb in anticipation of a major new trend in architecture. In fact, there's some of it. So how to judge all that? So the third part of that is conceive, test, judge. So using your powers of ask you to judge these maybe. So top there's a couple of stadia. These are big 80,000 seaters. Sydney on the left and Beijing on the right. And then 2 6,000 or 7,000 seater, the Water Cube and the Velo. So I've done this this comparison in lots of places, and people always say, well, that's pretty ugly, that one on the top left, and the one on the top right is really memorable, and that's quite nice, and actually that's not too bad either, but they're about equal. But they think that one at the top is terrible. It's very efficient. Those arches are fantastically efficient. It's got tension, a cable net in between, in tension. And so for the roof structure, it's only a simple comparison for the roofs. You can do, if you just do an embodied energy comparison, just over 8,000 trips around the world for the amount of energy in that steel structure. If you do the bird's nest, any idea how many round-the-world trips you could do for this steel in there? If it's 8,000 for Sydney, 75,000. So it's 10 times, nearly 10 times worse. This is 8 years of progress this represents. The water cube, which is much smaller, and of course the conceit with this is that the form is the most efficient form that can possibly. The soap bubbles are nature's perfect tension medium, which is utter nonsense. There's no cubic or rectangular soap bubble system anywhere on the planet. It's so absurd. I'm sorry, Tristram, if you're listening to this, but it really is nonsense. He's the ARPS engineer, who's a very talented engineer, aren't you, Tristram? He is really talented. But the amount of energy in that steel structure, because it's not very efficient, 4,500, and the Velo is six times more effective, because it's just tension and it uses the curvature properly. So I've been advocating sticking energy stickers on buildings like you do on washing machines. So we could have a hazardly guess, if on a scale of A to E for the bird's nest, what energy sticker would we put on that? E. E? Z minus. I think. What about for the water cube? 6 times worse than the Velodrome, but not as bad as the. I mean, that's probably about E. That's poor in terms of its embodied energy. What about for the Sydney? In terms of energy efficiency, it's about B in terms of. Now the reason for that is because they're not often used properly after the event, and I think that the Sydney one is reasonably used, and the Velo is meant to be reasonably used, but it can't score higher because we don't really know whether it will be. But I think there's a question mark about whether or not you want to do these. You think about Qatar and the World Cup and trying to do buildings in an environment like that for such a short period. It's a questionable benefit. So I said I'd do a tiny comparison with the aquatics, between the Velodrome and the aquatics. So this is the aquatic form, which is also a saddle. So this is what London has for the over the top of the swimming pool for the Olympics. And that's the under view, and that's the top view. Still a saddle, same roof area, approximately. That's it, under construction. And its structure is, it's 11 meters deep. It's designed by Zaha Hadid. I mean, very well supported by Arabs doing the engineering. 11 meters deep is the structure, and it weighs 3,200 tons. That structure. The Velodrome, this to remind me, is made of this stuff. It's 72 millimeters deep compared to 11.5 meters, and it weighs 80 tons, the roof, compared to 3,200. And yet Zaha, for all of her great sculptural qualities, is regularly given prize after prize after prize without anybody mentioning whether or not, in embodied energy terms or resources, such a form of architecture makes any sense. And I'll leave you to make your own mind up. You can have that, or you can have an 11.5 meter deep, 3,000 tons of steel. If you're a steel shareholder, of course, you like Zaha. And this has been published, this information. So if you look in the Learning Legacy stuff that was produced a couple of weeks ago, we've written quite a lot of, actually. No, not the Velodrome team. We've done all of the comparisons. Stadium Australia is in there over here, being reasonably efficient. Beijing National Stadium, these are per seat and per roof area. The Velo is very efficient, and the aquatics is there. It's obviously not quite so efficient, but it did It did help win the games for the UK, which is obviously of benefit. So you can make your own mind up. So Kevin McLeod thinks it's got mojo. The Velodrome's got mojo. We were shortlisted for the Sterling Prize this year. I mean, who cares about awards? I mean, I don't care about them anymore. We were shortlisted, and everybody was fantastic about the Velo, and they said it's the best building, and it seemed to be a shoo-in. There was a public vote that we got 63% of the public vote, and then Zaha won for the Evelyn Grace Academy. And I don't want to draw any link between this particular part of this talk and what I just mentioned about the aquatics. Obviously nothing to do with it because it's for a different project. She won for a school project. And then a whole bunch of architects said, that's a daft thing to do. Why did you give it to Zaha and it should have been the Velo? Anyway, but the question is why? What happened there? And I think that we were the victim of unintended consequences.
5 tons of lid are supported by just 4 timbers.
It's the thing that
if one
bites
timber
you in the
goes
bum,
down
as I
faster
said,
than the others, the whole
Roger,
system could jam. Even
Caroline
worse,
Bailey
the
of
lid could
ex-Imperial
crash down
College.
out of control, crushing one
Trying
of
to
the
use
timbers.
sand hydraulics.
We'll have Roger down this hole. I'll go down the back hole. If you go
So
one
engineering,
side and deal with the
you do
timbers,
scary things in engineering, lots of natural
Tell us what's happening,
forces,
so we won't be able to see
you organise everything, you
Right.
pits.
do your conception, you do your testing, you make your judgment,
When to take the timbers out.
and in the end,
Okay.
it works or it doesn't.
Right, you're going to start at the same time.
So this is to lower
One.
this
hold on.
sarcophagus roof that weighs several tons using sand hydraulics, dry sand which just flows out like water. Which is quite a neat system actually, and the Egyptians used it.
Yes, good, good. Okay.
Let the sand trickle out.
Yes, this one's dropped. Yes.
Which one?
Your side. Your side. Do your side, Chris, a bit more. Roger, hurry up. Roger! Okay, Chris's side.
My side.
Chris's side, more.
Both of them?
Yes?
Have you still got the timbers in?
At first, it all seems to be going to plan, but then
Stop!
disaster.
Oh no, this timber's stuck.
I don't believe it.
No, but slow down or something. There's a lump on the bottom of the concrete, so we've got a bit that's caught, so I'm going to have to bang it out of the way.
But the timber is wedged fast.
Now, the reason I put that in, I mean, I'm very fond of Caroline Bailey, but she only had one job to do in that, which was to make sure to take that piece of timber out, and she forgot to do it at the crucial moment, at which point the whole bloody thing failed. And it happens all the time, this stuff, and I think that like Roger's block breaking in the wrong place, it just doesn't, and you've got to deal with it and get on. And it's very frustrating, but that's how human beings work. Sometimes the unintended consequences are bad. Sometimes they're very good, and we have a little in our trust, because we've given, actually, contrary to what was said earlier by Andy, we've given away our company to an employee benefit trust, which we're the trustees of, and we have in it a graphics company as well who did this piece of work for the Singapore Gardens by the Bay, and they've done this piece of work, which it's using a piece of software developed by a guy called Gennaro Senatori, who is one of our engineering doctorates, and he has taken genetic algorithms and worked out a way of mapping those onto, in an evolutionary fashion, onto photographs. And so we're doing a project for Exeter University, and so that's a genetically grown pattern that comes from the flowers in the garden. And that's a positive unintended consequence, because no one realized that he was going to be able to do that when we started designing the software. And the best thing about it, well, it depends if you like it or not, is you can now buy ties which have that pattern on, which are using Gennaro's or a slightly stylized version of his software. So when we started, the unintended consequence we didn't expect was to be able to make cravats, but now we can. Fantastic. And in Barcelona, we've been doing this bullring project, which is a regeneration project. The people in Catalonia don't like bullfighting anymore. They like shopping. And so they decided to convert this into a shopping centre. So, and Laurie Abbott and from Richard Rogers we're doing this with, And we went down there, and this is actually my sketch. We stood there and we said, what we need up there is a big thing, like a UFO over the top of the thing. So we went through this heroic process of propping up, taking everything out from inside, propping up the walls, lowering the ground, digging a huge hole underneath it all, 6 stories down into the center of the earth. So the ground used to be up where those white things are, and that's all been taken down and all these V-supports put in. I mean, without dropping the bull ring, which would be an embarrassing thing to do. I mean, heroic engineering. I mean, it looks rather beautiful in this condition, I think. Dropped in the UFO on 4 sets of legs. So this is 1/4 of it. So it's 100 meters across. There it is, dropped in. So all there. And then on top of it, a big timber grid shell. And then they filled it up with shops, as you can imagine. And it looks exactly the same inside there as in any airport, anywhere in the world, any shopping center, anywhere around, Singapore. It could be anywhere in the world. So all that effort that we went to has the unintended consequence, or the unexpected consequence, that we now managed to design ourselves that feels like Gatwick, despite the fact we tried so hard to do something really special. But it got there. 300,000 people went there the first week, so it was very successful. It was far more people that went bullfighting. I went down, as was mentioned, to Imperial to try and do some teaching for the engineers, and we also tried to do some teaching for the academics about design, which was an interesting experience. And after that experience, one of the academics said about me, Chris is like an alien. Because the way that we were doing our stuff was completely different to what they were doing at Imperial. But I'm not an alien. I'm an ordinary. I play, sport, do DIY with proper safety equipment, as you can tell. Play the guitar, do bad paintings, and people give me prizes for my work, which is a really curious thing. So I don't know I can't even remember what this one was. Anyway, but I get awards for being an engineer. But I'm just an ordinary person, and I love doing things. And I think that this is sort of near the end, you'll be pleased to hear, but what I really think is fantastic is the delight of being able to do stuff. And it's such a privilege as an engineer to be able to get involved with people, with making things. I absolutely love it. So, and things do happen when you're working with other people that you're not expecting.
Last-minute surprise.
Make way for the deceased pharaoh, hard Hadam.
If the team is going to have a burial, it'll need something to bury, something small enough to fit.
He was a young pharaoh, hard Hadam was. But he died with his boots on. Well, we got to get this guy wrapped up.
Were the legs wrapped up together or separately?
Honestly. Nothing to do with you. You do the head.
Yes.
I used to work in an operating theatre, Excuse me. Don't do it too tight because it might affect the circulation.
The trouble is, you do these things, and it's all intense, so you get very little chance just to have a tiny bit of fun. But to be able to wrap up a dummy and worry about its circulation, which is what we were doing in the middle of all that, was fantastic. I loved it. And when we were doing Stockton, they had a similar thing. The people up there, they enjoy their pubs and their clubs, and so they decided that they would have a public vote for Stockton, for the bridge, and they would do it in the pubs. So they put all the schemes on beer mats, and basically said, right, okay, you can vote. On the back there's a number. You phone up and say, I like number C, or whatever it was, about 11 o'clock in the evening. 3 sheets to the wind. And so they all voted on the back of the beer mats. One of the local artists came down and painted the bridge as it was being built. He did 300 paintings in real time next to the bridge, and he allowed all the local people to paint it. I mean, it's a fantastic sort of community project. And then the locals, once it was finished, started, these are some of the locals, we went and interviewed them all. So they said things like, it's got better metal than the other bridges, which is true, has nice big pieces of metal. She said, I'm going to Riverside College and said, I'm doing hairdressing. It's going to be very helpful, which is great, so we're very pleased about that. The cyclists went happily cycling across. Another fella said, I didn't see the shine. So I tried jumping off the edge. I lost my phone, my wallet, and I also lost a shoe. So and this is the water, which he jumped into. We put on in between the balustrading things to stop them nicking the stainless steel cable that was forming the balustrade. We put these little cleats on so that you could only nick 6 meters. If you had a pair of bolt cutters, you could only nick 6 meters between the cleats, which meant it really wasn't worth being a vandal and nicking them. Normally you don't bother with that, but that was to stop this guy, amongst others. Back to our friends, they like the lights, more lights. They like the heavy metal. These are Spears and Major did the lighting, which is fantastic. And there's this beautiful little LED active thing where they just trigger from blue to white as you go past. So you get a sort of vapor trail as you walk along the bridge, and then they eventually go back to blue again, which is very cute. Very nice. It's a lovely way to spend your lunchtime. It feels cute, like little bunnies. They really did say all this. This is all Vox Pop stuff. And they did it themselves. What's really good about this is that the fact that they were out there at all on the bridge, I mean, they were interested in what was happening and expressed it. And 85% of the construction of that project was built by people within 15 miles of the site, because the old ironworkers still had the expertise, and there were a few little pockets of it still there. They could make the concrete, they could do the electrics and all that sort of stuff. So most of it was done locally. So they, apart from just being a regeneration project, it wasn't just parachuted in. They actually did it for themselves, which is even better as a community thing. So that's it, finished. They won the top structures prize a couple of years ago. And there was a massive party, which they all turned out for. I suppose the last word comes from these guys, who, the old fellas up there, had been there for years, their whole lives, and they're probably never going to work, but their families are there, they're still there, and the fact that it's put some pride back into them and their community. I mean, we didn't pay them to say these things. It's fantastic. One of the local taxi drivers, who talks to everybody. That's it.
So, thank you very much, Chris. If you'd like to take some questions, would you be able to
Yes,
do that?
yeah, sure.
We're doing questions, but the point is, could you use the microphone? Because otherwise the people who are on the webinar will have no idea what's going on. So could you just wait before you ask any questions? Put your hands up so that they can actually get it.
Hi. Sorry. I wanted to get your opinion on getting youngsters into the industry. Basically, how do you get school kids to say, I wonder what it would feel like to do that engineering?
It's a question which is exercising me a lot, because partly because I've got young kids, and also because I've been involved in university education and still am. And I think a lot of it has to be at the moment, extracurricular, which is very curious to say. But certainly when you're young, your experience is engineering. I mean, kids engineer the world. They build things, they make things, they mess around. As you get slightly older, it becomes very choreographed and rather strict in your early teens. And I think that of course, you can attempt to demystify engineering and turn it into a human activity, which is, that's how we try to work. But I know from having discussed the humanity of engineering with lots of people, it doesn't compute. Especially with engineers, quite often. They find it a hard thing to imagine emotion coming into it or that sort of thing. But actually, all the kick that you get out of doing it is very strong. And so it's just like any other sporting activity or anything, or art or anything, or playing an instrument. It's a great thing to do. So I think that there's a place for it in making connections between what you do in your extracurricular stuff with your mates. So playing sport, playing music, going on holiday and just experiencing the fact it's different climate, different temperatures, going swimming, understanding about canoeing, and everything that you do has an interaction. And I think that part of it, I mean, that's how I learned to be an engineer, not by going to college, really. And I think that that's the bit that needs to be drawn up. And I think if you get a more overt connection between those sorts of things and all that blue stuff I was showing, so not the specialism, but the bit that you need to understand, the things that you have in common with everybody else. I think you've got some chance of saying to people, it's not an extreme sport, being an engineer. It's something that anybody can do. You don't have to be a genius. You don't have to be Leonardo da Vinci. You can just do it as a thing. And I think it's also extremely, I mean, I make light of it in some ways, but it's extremely serious activity. And so if people have a particular predisposition to want to be doctors or want to, people who want to help as a natural thing, I think that they should be encouraged also to think about engineering as a way of putting something really good back into the community, and not treat it as it's not mathematics. Engineering is not a mathematical subject anymore for most people. It's about trying to design appropriate things to put onto the planet, and it's a serious activity. And if you've got some interest in trying to make the planet better, then it's a really good thing to get involved with. So I think it's about the culture of engineers who are practicing and who understand that stuff, standing up and explaining it and trying to show people that it's a human activity. There are very few good role models for youngsters, especially women. I mean, there are a few blokes around, but not many, and there are even less women that some schoolgirls can look to and say, right, I really want to. That's why I really respect that person, and I'd like to do that job. But I think it's a slow process. But it begins with people in this room and people who are professional engineers trying to be more human about it and less defensive.
Hello, my name's Josie. I loved your approach to engineering with doing and being in the world and understanding how the world works. But what worries me is what I've heard tell from the training of engineers is that they are not out in the world doing it. They're not even going to building sites and doing it and lifting and moving it. And I wondered how you, with your connections to universities, can start to discuss and sort of how you can see that changing in the future.
Well, firstly, I think I showed some of the students doing the Stockton Bridge at the construction area, and that was a thing that we started when we were down at Imperial in about 2002, I think, and with a contractor called John Doyle, and we were both academic and consultant, so we formed that triangle, and that's now being done by 50% of the universities in the country. And it's a physical training and an organizational training for students. And there's no reason why environmental engineers couldn't do it. There are some water projects on it. There was an energy project on it one year. I mean, you can do it quite easily. I mean, for students, I think that from memory, it's about £300 per person for the students, but they offset some of that. They raise the funds for it if they know it's coming, which is what we used to pay for a geology field trip, and perhaps they still do. So I think it's that's one way of being much more physical. It's very hard to understand why people come into engineering if they don't understand the physical world. At least for me, and we've had groups of students who have maybe a dozen at a time, or even sometimes 18 at a time, not one of whom has ever put up a shelf. They will say, I'm going to be an engineer, but I've never even put up a shelf. And that's the reason we invented the construction area. I think in terms of the sort of hands-on stuff, it's a challenge because there's so many other things for kids to do nowadays. I mean, instead of fixing a car or building a treehouse or messing around outdoors, even if you've got an outdoors, that's how we sort of learned, or some of us. I think it's very hard for people to get to grips with that. So out of out of that activity, I don't know, you've got to look for people who are a bit more physically interested and encourage them and think of it. I think the reading, writing, arithmetic, I think, or if you want to call it STEM, really, I think should have a sort of D attached to it, which is design, which is about how to take that stuff and actually do something useful with it. And then when I was sitting on the design council, we tried quite hard to get that put in, so D-STEM as opposed to just STEM, so that the design part of it became linked back to the technological training. That, you know, obviously the country has a good history in technological education, but we're being absolutely swamped by people who are much better at it than we are now, coming from lots of other countries. So I think the design part is the bit that gives the UK in particular an edge, because we're actually quite good at that. We were talking earlier, Andy and I, about if engineering becomes automated, what are the engineers going to do? Which is a reasonable question. I think is the answer.
Yeah. Well, can I ask a question? I wanted to know about the role of failure in design, and because we have an awful lot that's got to happen over the next 40 years, which seems to involve us learning by not managing to do things properly.
Yeah.
And how do we cope?
Well, I think it's a complex question, because the question of whether something actually works or not is a multifactorial question. Because if you just say, right, is it strong enough and will it fall down, or won't it fall down, let's say, or is it hot enough or cold enough or whatever, you can say, right, it works at that level. Whether or not you have a building at all is another question. So the question of whether or not you should be designing things. So there are a whole series of questions about whether or not something will work or fail. And I think that it's a failure to imagine that the answer to every single question is to build something new. And I think that I think part of the it's really important to recognize that human beings. I think Jacob Bronowski, who years ago, if any of you remember him, who did The Ascent of Man, he said human beings. In fact, he said human beings are unique amongst all the animal kingdom, that being able to, they don't have to fit themselves to the environment. Following Darwinian evolution, they can fit the environment to suit themselves. And they actually change the environment. Now, there are other animals, I think, do that as well. But nevertheless, the point was made that we're actually able to adapt ourselves and our environment. And I think that we shouldn't be so afraid at trying something and making a decision and then saying, okay, well, it will change it. And I think it's if you need the answer to everything before you start, the world is so complicated. Firstly, the answer is going to be wrong, and secondly, you're not even going to move. So I'm a person who likes the artistic approach to things, which says, right, start and go in that direction, and as soon as you get a bit more knowledge or a bit more experience, then change direction, and then change again and again and again. And you might end up over there, which would be a good place, rather than if you try and plan it out at the beginning to go in that direction, sure as eggs is eggs, you'll get over there and you'll realize I should have been on that way. So it's a long way of saying, I don't be afraid of experiment. I think it might be easier environmentally, actually, because the consequence of having the long-term consequences are profound. But there's some room for manoeuvre in terms of the performance criteria that everybody's designing for. What's acceptable? What's the perceived wisdom as to what's reasonable? Whereas when you're dealing with gravity or earthquakes, it tends to be a sense of don't drop things is usually a good plan. There's a margin for error is only upwards, not downwards. Whereas I think in environmental design, you've got at least in the experimental phase, you've got a possibility of. And the other thing that's important, is that when people do have things that fail, they need to get it back into the gene pool. And I think that there is a real problem with commercial protectiveness about people if anything goes wrong. If people talk about projects, they only ever talk about the bits that went right. You never hear about the bit that went wrong, which is the bit you actually learn from. So there needs to be something, I don't know, in the building regs. We'll write a regulation to say if anything goes wrong, you put it back in the building regs, otherwise you're not going to get permission for your next project. I don't know, we can't be that dumb that we can't invent a system.
Any more questions?
Slightly rose-tinted, maybe.
Just
Oh yes, I'm Swan Duran. Yes, I'm most impressed at your presentation. You're very practical, even some of the traditional ways of doing things like the sand hydronics and all of that stuff. And also this thing about failure, because even, I mean, I'm mechanical myself, but even in my industry, it's like, you know, you have a lot of, sometimes you might have failures, you're trying to find out why something's not working, even though you've tried going by the book, then you have to think outside of the book. So what really inspired you to do what you to think outside the box and then to also to cover yourself legally, because you know, you could be doing all this testing, but then you could be sued right, left, and centre.
Yes. 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 Well, it's a fine line you trade, obviously. The only thing that's ever gone wrong big time was the Millennium Bridge. That's the only thing I've had fail on me. And I've done a lot of experimental projects, or what people think of as experimental projects, and they've all worked, more or less. And so what inspired me was, well, I mentioned there seemed to be a slight rugby theme. I didn't really realise, but I have played a lot of sport. I still play sport. And I think we were always in a very successful team when we were younger. And so even when we were losing, we just assumed we were going to win. And that bred a certain sort of optimism about the end result, which just said, just keep going, and in the end you're going to prevail. And sure enough, we did. And it was remarkable how consistently that happened. And that I honestly... I use the same approach in everything I do. So I sort of, and I'm not afraid of making bad decisions. So because I'm not precious about them. So I'm quite happy to make a decision, and then if something better comes along, provided that it's possible, I will. And then you're not going to mess up too many people or all that sort of thing. I would try and change the decision in the light of new information, and I think that's a very healthy thing until it's too late. At which point you don't change the decision anymore, obviously. Rather than say, right, that's what we're going to do, and we're never going to move.
Oh yes, I think I agree. You do need to experiment, but as you say, obviously you've got to look after your clients, and obviously you've got to deliver, buildings what your clients want. But now we've always got these challenges like airtight buildings, trying to use less materials, how people use the building, all of that stuff. But I suppose there's experimentation on the other side. I suppose if a company could do really well, then they could probably afford to spend a bit of money on experimentation.
We run as I said, we run an employee benefit trust, and we have, which is similar to John Lewis and people like that. And it's operated for the benefit of the staff, and the benefit is normally in an employee benefit trust is normally money, and we have chosen to put money at the bottom of the list of benefits. And we've in the first line of the trust deed, which is a legal document that lasts for 80 years. Which says what the purpose of everything is. We've said it's to be a trailblazing organization, ethical, intelligent, sustainable, in any aspect of the human environment. That's what we've put as our top line in our trustees. So we're legally obliged to behave that way now, whereas we've always done it sort of in a sort of amateurish fashion before, but we now actually, the trustees are obliged to try and operate. Now we may crash and burn as a result of that, but it's changed people's behavior because they're now going around saying, where are we innovating? Where are we experimenting? How can we get that information in somewhere else? And the thing about trailblazing, the reason we chose those words is to make it visible, not just for us, but for other people. So we're trying to do things unlike, I did a job for McLaren once, and down in Woking. And they had 15 years of failed Grand Prix cars that they had tested the hell out of, and they had all the information stashed away in their own private files that we're never going to share with anybody because it gave them a competitive advantage. And a lot of that information would be really useful. And I don't think that is healthy. Given the nature of the questions we're facing now, I would rather, if we find something out, to get it out there so other people can use it. So, the sort of experimental nature of our practice and the work we do is intended to put up examples that other people can copy, if they're any good.
Question from somebody who's listening on the web, Chris. Melanie Thompson asks, how do you encourage designers to have greater empathy for building users?
For building users?
For building users.
It's very difficult. And in fact, we had Sunan Prasad, who was the past president of the RIBA, who's a very good empathetic architect. Does a lot of schools, colleges, hospital, health work. He came to the practice and spoke to us Tuesday lunchtime, and he said, and I think it's the only way you can do it. You basically have to talk to the people who are involved in the project and try and understand what they want, and it's fraught with danger because for every person you talk to, you get a different opinion, and it's part of the skill of a designer to try to read between the lines, to try and hear what hasn't been said, to try to think there might be another side to the story, and make some sort of judgment on the basis of as much information as you can get hold of. But it's profoundly difficult because I was brought up in Reigate down in Surrey, and at one point they built a new little tiny supermarket in the middle of the high street, which I was absolutely mortified by. And I knew the local planning authority fellow who was a friend of a friend. I went to see him and said, how dare you choose such a thing in the middle of our high street? And he said, well, it's, do you realize that we get more employment, we get more rates, we get this, that, and the other, we can do all these other things I hadn't even thought about, but I was mortified. So that was in my own town, which I knew very well. You can imagine trying to design for communities or occupations or practices that you don't know. But I do take some heart from the fact that humans are very adaptable. And so, in a sense, provided that the building is not too constrained, or the project or the city, for that matter, is not too constrained, there's a pretty good chance that people, once they occupy it, will adapt it in a way which is better suited to their needs. And I don't think that the designer should pretend that they're omnipotent and omniscient and understand everything at the beginning. We should try and design things which are more changeable. And there's a Stuart Brand's book on how buildings learn, which goes into that. Is a very good sort of reference, although it's out of print now, on that. Allow buildings to adapt, I think, is but try and get as close to the right answer at the beginning as you can, knowing that it'll be wrong.
Well,
it's a question. There's one at the back.
One at the back.
Chris, I've admired you over the years in the progressive nature of your thinking in engineering.
Thank you.
But I'm reminded of the old saying that the reasonable man expects the world to adapt to him. The unreasonable man expects the world to adapt to himself. In that respect, it is the unreasonable man who creates progress in the world. If you agreed with that, do you see yourself as an unreasonable man?
Some people have said I'm unreasonable, but I think it's unjustified. In fact, I think it's unreasonable to say that. I suppose my simple answer is the way that I try to do things, and I'm trying to encourage other people to do things, is to try to understand as much as you can about the thing you're working on. Make a proposition, get it out there, and then take as much of the sort of feedback that comes back as possible into the mix. So if you don't put a proposition out there and you're trying to be reasonable, perhaps you're not going to get much in the way of feedback, at which point you're not going to flush out what people really think. So, and I've often been criticized by students and by staff for being too dogmatic, or too, you always tell us what the answer is. But I really don't. All I'm trying to do is to say, right, here's the starting point, and please, kick against it. And so in that sense, I suppose I'm reasonably unreasonable, because what I do is I put something into the position which is probably unreasonable and hope that somebody with much more wisdom than I've got will come back with a reasoned argument as to why there's an alternative. And I strongly believe that engineers should not take the position of saying, can't do that, can't do that. You know, if they're going to say that, they've got to come up with an alternative proposition or keep their mouth shut. So far, no one has asked me a question about thermodynamics, which I'm very glad about.
Chris, thank you very much. And certainly, I think you are embodying peaks of understanding, and one can see how some of this may ripple out. But you can tell from the grey in my hair that I'm towards the end of my career, and one of the things I'm doing at the moment on CIBSE's behalf is working with the European Commission. And I'm troubled by two big issues. The first is that regulation is now increasingly replacing judgment on almost everything we do. And alongside that, we've got to grapple with the existing building stock as well as the articles of function and delight. So, with those things preoccupying me, do you have a vision for cities in the next 30, 50 years, and anything which you can cascade down to lesser mortals?
Well, I think that the thing about regulation is I think that, I think I alluded to it earlier, that it would be really good if regulation was based on useful performance and not on some arbitrary imagined standard. So I mean, the structural world is and civils is far worse than environmental, because it's been regulated for longer, and we're still using design loads, live loads in buildings that are inherited from warehouses in 100 years ago for offices. So a place of work, an office, is still designed using the same code of practice as a warehouse was 100 years back. And if you look in the London Building Act, you can still find it. And to get that changed is a real problem. But if you were to say, just make something which is good enough for people to use as a place of work, and allow the engineer and the designer to use their skill to hit that target, then it puts the emphasis on the people who are starting to specify buildings and that sort of thing, to be a bit more careful about what they ask for. And it puts the emphasis back onto the engineer to be a bit more skillful in how they respond, because they can actually respond on a performance basis. On the question of reusing buildings, I think that probably, in fact I'm certain, that the majority of the buildings that are going to be around in cities, well certainly in first world cities, in 30 or 50 years' time will be buildings we've got at the moment. And quite a small proportion will be new. And I think that we have to be much more inventive in the way that we allow the change of usage of those buildings, because I think that there's an implicit criticism of the planning situation. I don't believe that the planning process is done with enough intelligence in terms of attempting to weigh what is really useful and really helpful against what might be expedient for a particular situation. And I mean, there are many examples of planning decisions which are really bonkers, and they're principally driven by, and they destroy cities, they destroy towns, they destroy communities, driven by a short-term financial gain, for example. And so I think that I'm for a relaxation of planning strictures, but an increase in the level of expertise and knowledge that is required on the part of the people who are sitting in judgment. And so it probably means that people who, the architectural profession, urban design profession, need to participate on the planning side, not on the judgment side, not so much on the design side. And CABE which has done very good work over the last sort of 8 or 10 years, much more advanced in its thinking than the Royal Fine Arts Commission that preceded it. I think that CABE is an example of at least getting some of the better contemporary designers into the mix. But there are very few environmentalists there. There are very few social policy people and people who understand about communities, and there's no one there who understands aging. There's no one there who understands about social mobilization. I mean, there's sort of things that are missing from CABE. So CABE make a recommendation on a building, and they're still operating even under the Design Council. They make a recommendation on the building, and it's contained to their sphere of knowledge, and it doesn't take on board many of the things that actually go to make really good communities. So I think that we were trying to argue inside the Design Council because for a long time the Design Council didn't even treat architecture and engineering as a design activity. And the reason they didn't treat it was because it doesn't have design after it. You can be a graphic designer or a jewelry designer, but if you're an engineer or an architect or a services engineer or an environmental or a sustainability, if you don't put designer after it, you don't count as a designer. And so public policy about design didn't include, at least insofar as the contact through the Design Council, which was fairly strong in terms of changing government policy, didn't include the likes of us in that conversation. The CABE thing, now CABE having gone there, is very useful because it has forced, at last, a recognition that we're all in this together and that it's much broader than just people who happen to call themselves designers. And the net result of that in the longer term, hopefully, will be that government policy will shift a bit, so it's a little bit broader based. But it still misses the psychological side of it, the sort of demographic change side of things. And I think it's, but I do think the planning judgment part of it, it's easy for us to criticize because if we don't get consent for something, then we complain. But actually, I think it would do with the planning community being treated far more seriously as an important profession than it is at the moment. They thought of it as a bloody nuisance that you have to a hurdle you have to jump over, rather than somebody who's actually going to enable you to put your building into a better community. But it's a long play. These things are sort of, I know you're at the end of your career, or near the end of your career, and I'm quite near the end of my career. Well, not as near as you, but I do think that these are 10 or 15 year plays. I'm sure you've got many good years in you.
Okay, thank you. I mean, we do have to come to an end, and so can I? Firstly, I'd just like to thank you personally for explaining your life in the blue bubble. That was great. And now I'd like to invite David Fisk to formally give us our vote of thanks for your work.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to thank Chris. He won't remember, but in my first week at Imperial College, he and I went to have a coffee in the senior common room, and we got to talking about the iPod, which was a great new invention at the time. And I know Chris, this is an enormous, wide-ranging engineering knowledge, could have taken the lid off and explained to me what was going on, but instead he drew my attention to what in the early iPod was this extraordinary lotus box that opened up, that gave you the extraordinary impression of the journey you were about to take as you moved into Apple's new world. And I think tonight, you've taken us on a very similar journey, one of experience and challenge to us. We all venture to think we have an imagination. I think Chris's challenge is we are not firing up enough if we've seen what he did and how he challenges himself. I thought that was tremendous. And then actually, wasn't there another thing that I thought, gosh, I could feel the room resonating with, oh yeah, we've been there. That sort of sense is, you suddenly have a great imaginative idea and then suddenly your brain accidentally thinks you've also imagined a truth. And it's not actually till you try it that you discover the challenges you put into the physical world. And I thought, gosh, that's absolutely right. How many designers I've sometimes met who actually got rather bored with the truth, and the design was the thing that somebody else had made. And then a really insightful thought, surely, that actually one can make that discovery on one's own, but how much richer it is to have made that discovery about the discrepancy between imagination and truth when you're within a team like you had in the model research or whatever that platform is. So I thought that was tremendous. And I think it's a real inspiration for us to think just a bit harder in services about just what the challenges are. And that lovely phrase is that, please, we mustn't breathe in